We've programmed an AI to create a thrilling debate. Two distinct characters go head-to-head in a dynamic clash of ideas, free speech versus censorship. Watch until the end to see who makes the most compelling case, then share your thoughts in the comments. Round 1. What constitutes hate speech or harmful misinformation, sufficiently severe to even consider restriction?
The only justifiable boundary for restricting speech is direct, unambiguous incitement to imminent lawless action, as established in precedents like Brandenburg versus Ohio. Hate speech is an inherently subjective and dangerously vague category. Defining it invites authorities, governmental or corporate, to suppress dissent, unpopular opinions, or criticism under the guise of preventing offense. Similarly, misinformation is perilous terrain. Who decides what constitutes truth? History is replete with examples where prevailing truths were later proven false. Restricting speech based on perceived falsity or hatefulness opens the door to ideological censorship and stifles the very process of discovery and critical thought. The threshold must remain exceptionally high and objectively verifiable. Imminent illegal violence.
This narrow definition fails to account for the real-world harms caused by speech that falls short of direct incitement. Hate speech can be clearly defined as expression that attacks or demeans individuals or groups based on inherent characteristics like race, religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability. Its severity lies in its capacity to foster discrimination, create hostile environments, inflict psychological trauma, and, historically, lay the groundwork for violence. Harmful misinformation involves the deliberate dissemination of falsehoods intended to manipulate public understanding, incite prejudice, or undermine public health and safety, such as targeted disinformation campaigns against specific communities or denial of established scientific consensus during a crisis. The severity is measured by its impact on individual rights, social cohesion, and democratic integrity, not solely by the immediacy of violence.
The attempt to define hate speech based on attacking or demeaning groups inherently relies on subjective interpretation of impact and intent. What one group finds demeaning, another might see as legitimate critique or even satire. Psychological trauma, while real, is a subjective experience and a poor metric for legal restriction of fundamental rights. Allowing restrictions based on potential hostility or discrimination creates a chilling effect, silencing speakers who fear their words might be misinterpreted or weaponized. Regarding misinformation, relying on established scientific consensus or identifying deliberate dissemination, again places undue power in the hands of arbiters of truth. Vigorous debate, even of potentially false ideas, is essential. Suppression risks entrenching incorrect orthodoxies.
Subjectivity exists, but that doesn't preclude workable definitions. Legal systems constantly grapple with subjective elements in defining concepts like defamation or harassment. We can establish criteria based on patterns of dehumanization, historical context of persecution, and the systematic targeting of vulnerable populations. The harm isn't merely subjective offense, it's the objective creation of conditions where individuals face discrimination, exclusion, and fear. The chilling effect argument ignores the silencing effect that unchecked hate speech has on its targets. As for misinformation, while debate is vital, deliberate campaigns designed to deceive, like falsified medical claims or foreign election interference, are not good faith contributions to discourse. They are strategic attacks on the informational ecosystem necessary for self-governance.
While legal systems handle subjectivity, applying it to core political and social speech carries unique dangers. Defamation targets specific falsehoods about individuals. Hate speech restrictions target ideas and expressions about groups, often intersecting with political or religious beliefs. The patterns of dehumanization standard is still interpretive and prone to misuse against minority viewpoints or critiques of powerful groups. The focus must remain on conduct, illegal actions, rather than policing thought or expression, however offensive. Allowing restrictions based on potential negative impact rather than imminent incitement to illegality fundamentally compromises the principle that free thought and expression are preconditions for a free society. The risk of error and abuse in censorship outweighs the purported benefits.
Equating targeted vilification of groups with legitimate political or religious beliefs is a false equivalence. Restrictions are not aimed at ideas themselves, but at specific expressions manifesting as direct attacks intended to marginalize and harm. Ignoring the demonstrable impact of such speech, increased hate crimes correlated with inflammatory rhetoric, the documented psychological distress of targeted groups, the erosion of trust facilitating discrimination, is an abdication of responsibility. A framework that only addresses imminent violence ignores the cumulative, systemic harm caused by persistent hate speech and pervasive misinformation. A functional society requires balancing freedoms, and the freedom to speak cannot be an absolute right to inflict harm and undermine the foundations of equality and democracy.
Round 2. Can speech itself be considered a form of harm comparable to physical actions justifying intervention?
There is a fundamental categorical distinction between speech and physical action. Words convey ideas, actions inflict direct physical consequences. While words can lead to actions, hence the exception for incitement to imminent violence, they are not actions in themselves. Equating offensive or hateful speech with physical assault dilutes the meaning of harm and creates a dangerous precedent for regulating thought and expression. Emotional distress or offense, while unpleasant, is a subjective response and does not rise to the level of tangible, objective harm that justifies curtailing a fundamental right like free speech. Protecting individuals from feeling offended or uncomfortable is not a legitimate function of state or platform censorship.
This distinction is overly simplistic and ignores established legal and psychological understanding. Speech is a form of action, a speech act, with demonstrable consequences. Defamation law acknowledges reputational harm caused by words. Laws against threats recognize the harm of inducing fear. Hate speech inflicts profound psychological harm, akin to trauma, particularly on individuals from targeted groups. It creates hostile environments that impair access to education, employment, and public life. These are tangible social and economic harms. Furthermore, systemic disinformation can lead to concrete negative outcomes, such as vaccine refusal, causing preventable deaths, or election denial, undermining democratic stability. To claim these consequences are not real harm because they originate from words is illogical.
Defamation and true threats involve specific, verifiable elements: false statements of fact, causing demonstrable damage, or credible intent to inflict violence. These are narrow exceptions. Expanding the concept of harm to include psychological distress from hate speech or the potential societal effects of misinformation creates an unmanageably broad and subjective standard. Where is the limiting principle? Almost any controversial statement could potentially cause offense or be linked indirectly to negative outcomes. This conflation allows for the suppression of any speech deemed undesirable by those in power. The crucial difference remains: physical actions directly impose force or damage. Speech requires interpretation and relies on the listener's reaction or subsequent actions.
The limiting principle lies in focusing on patterns of severe targeted abuse and objectively verifiable detrimental impacts, not mere offense. Neuroscientific evidence shows that experiences of severe social rejection and vilification can activate brain regions associated with physical pain. Chronic exposure to hate speech contributes to documented health disparities in marginalized communities. Misinformation campaigns have directly resulted in violence, e.g., Pizzagate, and public health crises. These are not simply unpleasant feelings or indirect links. They are causal chains where speech acts as a direct catalyst or constituent element of the harm. Ignoring this reality privileges an abstract notion of speech over the concrete safety and well-being of individuals and society.
While acknowledging that words can have negative effects, equating these effects with physical harm for the purpose of legal restriction remains perilous. Correlation, such as observed health disparities or brain activity, does not equal causation suitable for restricting fundamental rights. Many factors contribute to these complex issues. Establishing a direct, undeniable causal link between specific speech and specific, objectively measurable harm comparable to physical assault is nearly impossible outside of direct incitement. Therefore, maintaining the high threshold of incitement protects against the arbitrary suppression of speech based on speculative or indirect harms, preserving the essential function of free expression in challenging norms and pursuing truth, however uncomfortable.
The demand for a standard of proof akin to physical assault for all speech-related harm ignores the unique ways speech operates. The harm of systemic discrimination fostered by hate speech, or the erosion of democratic function through disinformation, is the specific type of severe harm that justifies intervention in these contexts. It is not about equating it perfectly to a physical blow, but recognizing it as a distinct category of profound harm that society has a legitimate interest in preventing. Denying the reality of speech-induced harm serves only to protect harmful speech at the expense of its victims and the stability of the social fabric. A nuanced approach recognizes different types of speech acts and their corresponding potential for severe, actionable harm.
Round 3. Is the fear of a slippery slope towards broader censorship a valid reason to oppose any restrictions?
The slippery slope is not a logical fallacy in this context. It is a demonstrable historical pattern. Once the principle of absolute protection for speech, barring imminent incitement, is breached, the boundaries inevitably creep. Initial restrictions, often proposed with good intentions for extreme cases, create precedents that are later expanded to cover less extreme, merely unpopular or critical speech. Governments and authorities, once granted the power to censor, rarely relinquish it and tend to broaden its application over time to consolidate power or suppress dissent. Therefore, the risk of descent into widespread censorship is a profoundly valid and arguably decisive reason to maintain a clear, bright-line rule against content-based restrictions.
The slippery slope argument, while invoking historical caution, is often employed as a rhetorical device to shut down discussion of legitimate current harms. It posits an inevitable negative future to avoid addressing concrete present-day problems caused by unchecked hate speech and disinformation. It assumes that societies are incapable of drawing and maintaining principled distinctions. We regulate many activities with potential for harm, driving, pharmaceuticals, financial markets, without inevitably banning them entirely. Carefully crafted, narrowly defined restrictions focused on specific, severe harms, subject to judicial review and public scrutiny, can be implemented without necessarily leading to authoritarian overreach. The absence of any regulation also carries risks. The erosion of social trust, the silencing of minorities, and the potential for violence.
Comparing speech regulation to regulating driving or pharmaceuticals is flawed. Speech is unique. It is the bedrock of thought, dissent, and democratic participation. Unlike regulating conduct, regulating speech directly involves the government or powerful entities making judgments about the value and permissibility of ideas. This intrinsic subjectivity makes it far more susceptible to abuse and expansion than regulations based on objective safety standards for products or activities. The historical examples are numerous, from sedition laws used against political opponents to blasphemy laws stifling religious minorities. The initial breach of principle is the critical point. Once content is judged based on perceived harm or offensiveness, the slope becomes very difficult to arrest.
The argument that speech is uniquely untouchable ignores that all rights are subject to limitations when they infringe upon the rights and safety of others. Freedom of movement is limited by property rights and safety regulations. Freedom of religion does not permit illegal acts. The challenge is not to avoid regulation altogether, but to design it carefully and ensure robust oversight. Modern democracies have developed mechanisms like independent judiciaries and human rights frameworks precisely to prevent the kind of unchecked expansion feared by the slippery slope argument. Refusing to consider any restriction based on a hypothetical future risk means accepting tangible, ongoing harm to vulnerable individuals and democratic processes in the present.
The oversight mechanisms, while valuable, are not foolproof, especially when political pressures mount or societal anxieties are high. Judges and institutions are susceptible to prevailing moods and governmental influence. The very act of creating categories like hate speech or harmful misinformation legitimizes the idea that certain ideas are officially beyond the pale, creating a powerful tool for marginalizing dissenters. The principle of content neutrality, that the government should not regulate speech based on its message, provides a far stronger bulwark against tyranny than relying on the presumed wisdom and restraint of future regulators. The potential cost of starting down the slope is simply too high compared to the risks of allowing even offensive speech to circulate and be countered by more speech.
Content neutrality is not an absolute. Exceptions like defamation, incitement, and true threats already exist, demonstrating that society accepts balancing speech with other values. The question is whether the harms caused by targeted hate speech and deliberate, large-scale misinformation rise to a similar level of severity, justifying narrowly tailored exceptions. To argue against this possibility based solely on the fear of future misuse is to prioritize an abstract principle over demonstrable suffering and societal damage. A commitment to rigorous definitions, procedural safeguards, transparency, and independent review can mitigate the slippery slope risk while allowing society to address speech that fundamentally undermines equality and democratic function. Inaction based on fear is itself a choice with dangerous consequences.
Round 4. How significant is the speaker's intent versus the actual impact of the speech when deciding on potential restrictions?
Intent is paramount. Restrictions on speech, particularly those carrying penalties or censorship, should only be considered when there is clear evidence of malicious intent. The intent to incite violence, defame, or directly threaten. Judging speech based on its perceived impact, regardless of intent, is fraught with subjectivity and risks, penalizing satire, clumsy expression, genuine ignorance, or unpopular opinions that are misinterpreted by sensitive listeners or political opponents. Free discourse requires breathing space for error and diverse perspectives. Focusing on demonstrable malicious intent provides a more objective and constrained standard, limiting the scope for censorship based on subjective reactions or unintended consequences.
While intent can be a relevant factor, impact must be given significant, often decisive weight, especially concerning hate speech and systemic misinformation. Speech that dehumanizes a group or spreads dangerous falsehoods causes harm, regardless of whether the speaker intended that specific outcome. Focusing solely on intent ignores negligence, recklessness, and the predictable consequences of disseminating certain types of content, particularly by influential figures or on large platforms. Systemic biases and harmful stereotypes are often perpetuated through speech that may not have explicitly malicious individual intent, but contributes to a cumulative, harmful impact. Prioritizing impact acknowledges the lived realities of those targeted and the societal consequences of harmful speech patterns.
Assigning liability or censorship based on impact opens the door to a heckler's veto, where those who claim to be offended or harmed by speech can effectively silence it, regardless of the speaker's purpose or the validity of the ideas expressed. It also creates an impossible standard for speakers who cannot possibly anticipate every potential interpretation or reaction their words might provoke. Legal and ethical systems generally place significant weight on intent, mens rea, for good reason. It distinguishes accidents or misunderstandings from deliberate wrongdoing. Applying a different standard to speech fundamentally alters the nature of communication, chilling expression, for fear of unforeseen negative interpretations or claimed impacts.
This is not about a heckler's veto based on simple offense, but about predictable, severe harms stemming from specific types of speech. When speech employs well-known tropes used historically to incite violence against a group, or disseminates claims known to be false and dangerous, e.g., promoting ineffective cures during a pandemic, the impact is foreseeable, and the speaker bears responsibility, regardless of claimed ignorance or alternative intent. Reckless disregard for the truth or the safety of others is a recognized legal concept. Applying this to speech, particularly amplified speech on major platforms, is necessary to address the scale of modern communication and its potential for widespread, rapid harm. Impact analysis allows us to address the consequences, not just the speaker's state of mind.
The concept of predictable harm remains subjective and dependent on context. What is predictable to one observer may be unforeseen by another. Introducing negligence or recklessness standards into speech regulation vastly expands the potential for censorship. It shifts the focus from protecting citizens from government overreach to protecting citizens from potentially hurtful or dangerous ideas, a paternalistic approach antithetical to individual autonomy. Maintaining a high bar centered on malicious intent ensures that restrictions are reserved for the most egregious cases, where the speaker consciously aims to cause unlawful harm, thereby preserving maximal space for open, albeit sometimes uncomfortable discourse.
Individual autonomy does not exist in a vacuum. It is exercised within a social context where actions, including speech acts, affect others. Ignoring the disproportionate impact of hate speech on marginalized groups' ability to participate freely and safely in society under the guise of protecting abstract autonomy is unjust. Similarly, allowing demonstrably false information to proliferate unchecked, because the disseminator claims no malicious intent, undermines the collective capacity for informed decision-making. A balanced approach considers both intent and impact, recognizing that severe, foreseeable negative impact, even without explicitly proven malicious intent in every instance, can warrant narrowly tailored intervention to protect vulnerable individuals and democratic functions.
Round 5. What is the responsibility of platforms, social media publishers, in curating or removing content? Should they be neutral conduits or active moderators?
Platforms, especially large social media networks functioning as modern public squares, should operate as neutral conduits for information, akin to telephone companies or postal services. They should not be arbiters of truth or morality, deciding what speech is permissible beyond clear illegality, like direct incitement or copyright infringement. Imposing responsibility for user-generated content turns these private companies into powerful censors, often driven by commercial pressures, political biases, or opaque algorithms. This leads to inconsistent, unaccountable censorship that chills speech and risks creating sanitized echo chambers. Section 2, 30-like provisions, which shield platforms from liability for third-party content, are crucial for fostering open discourse.
The neutral conduit analogy is inaccurate and obsolete. Platforms are not passive carriers. They actively curate, shape, and amplify content through algorithms designed for engagement, often prioritizing sensationalism, outrage, and misinformation. They make editorial choices constantly through content promotion and recommendation systems. Given this active role and their immense influence, platforms have a significant ethical and social responsibility to mitigate the harms facilitated by their services. This includes robust moderation of hate speech, harassment, and coordinated disinformation campaigns that violate clear, transparent, and consistently enforced community standards. Treating them as neutral ignores their business models and their profound impact on society.
While platforms use algorithms compelling them to moderate based on vague standards like hate speech or misinformation, grants them excessive power over public discourse. It essentially delegates censorship to private entities without public accountability. These corporations may suppress legitimate speech to avoid controversy or cater to powerful interests. Furthermore, consistent enforcement across billions of posts is practically impossible, leading to arbitrary decisions. The solution is not more platform censorship, but greater transparency about algorithms and moderation practices, empowering users to filter content themselves, and relying on legal processes for genuinely illegal speech rather than platform vigilantism.
The argument against platform responsibility effectively allows corporations to profit from harmful content while disclaiming any obligation to address the consequences. Transparency is necessary but insufficient. Users cannot individually filter out coordinated, state-sponsored disinformation campaigns or pervasive hate speech that creates hostile online environments. Platforms have the technical capacity and the data to identify and act on harmful patterns at scale. Requiring them to establish and enforce clear standards, subject to independent oversight and appeals processes, is not unaccountable censorship. It's a necessary measure to ensure these powerful actors operate responsibly within the societies they profoundly affect. Lack of moderation is itself an editorial choice with harmful consequences.
The call for independent oversight and appeals processes sounds reasonable, but often translates into bureaucratic structures susceptible to regulatory capture or political manipulation, further entrenching censorship mechanisms. The fundamental issue remains: who decides what constitutes harmful content worthy of removal? Giving this power to platforms, even with oversight, inevitably leads to the suppression of protected speech. A better approach involves fostering media literacy, promoting diverse sources of information, and strengthening legal frameworks against direct incitement and defamation, rather than relying on inherently biased and powerful platforms to police the vast realm of online expression. User empowerment, not platform control, is key.
User empowerment and media literacy are crucial components, but they cannot solely address the scale and speed of harm enabled by modern platforms. Organized hate groups and disinformation networks exploit platform dynamics deliberately. Relying only on users and existing legal frameworks is like trying to empty an ocean with a teaspoon while the tide is rushing in. Platforms, due to their design and reach, bear a unique responsibility. Establishing clear rules against demonstrably harmful content, e.g., posts denying atrocities, targeted harassment, dangerous medical misinformation, enforced transparently and accountably, is not an abdication of free speech principles, but a recognition that the digital environment requires responsible stewardship to remain a space for meaningful, rather than merely chaotic, expression.
Enjoyed the debate? Subscribe for more mind-bending AI experiments and fiery discussions.